Hey, welcome back. The more I research unusual accidents, the more I'm surprised by how often food is involved. For something we rely on every day, it can go wrong in ways you'd never expect. From homemade hot candy that brought down its own creator, to a retired referee whose favorite Sunday dinner became his last because of a serving of collard greens. It was January 11th, 2017, in Elkhart, Indiana. The rented church kitchen beneath St. Brigid's still smelled of last Sunday's coffee. Gray snow banked against the loading door while two fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Only two women were working downstairs. The woman working there was Nora Ellison, 52. 5 years earlier, after her husband died of pancreatic cancer, she kept alive the homemade candy business they had built together. What began as extra income had become the mortgage payment. That January was her busiest week. A regional gift shop wanted nearly 400 boxes before the weekend, and a snowstorm was expected that night. Missing the delivery could cost her the order and possibly the customer. Nora told her daughters she only had to get through one long day. Her own kitchen was too small for batches that size, so she rented the church kitchen. Her 19-year-old neighbor, Kayla, came by after classes to help package the candy. But there was a problem. The kitchen's exhaust hood had failed the week before. The custodian left a note on the door asking that nobody use the range until it was fixed. However, Nora propped the alley door open instead, which dropped the room to about 50 degrees and made the steam hang. A winter storm warning was in effect for that evening, with 6 to 9 inches expected after 10 o'clock. Kayla was portioning finished candy at the far counter. Nora brought the syrup to the hard crack stage, about 300 degrees, checked it with a clip thermometer, gave it a last stir, and laid the long wooden spoon across the rim of the pot. Syrup that had boiled over earlier had dried where the handle met the lip. It probably looked like nothing worth cleaning off right away, just a speck you'd easily miss. But later on, that little detail would change everything about the case. Instead of ladling, she took the pot by its two side handles and raised it off the burner at chest height. The spoon, glued in place by the hardened sugar, caught the underside of the vent shelf. The pot stopped, tipped toward her, and the syrup came over the near edge in a thick stream that splashed across her as it poured over the rim. It landed across her chin, throat, and the top of her chest and stayed there, cooling against her skin and burning through it at the same time. She pulled in a breath to scream, and a small amount ran into her open mouth and over the back of her tongue. She dropped the pot. More syrup spread across the floor mat and over her shoes. Kayla saw all of it from 12 feet away. Kayla held Nora's burns under cool running water without trying to remove the hardened sugar. Firefighters arrived and found she was still talking, but swallowing had become noticeably harder. At the hospital, doctors tried to place a breathing tube, but the burn tissue inside her throat had already swollen too much. An emergency airway was attempted, but she died at 4 minutes past midnight. The coroner ruled the death accidental. In simple terms, boiling sugar sticks to the skin instead of running off, so it continues releasing heat as it cools. The burns inside Nora's throat kept worsening until swelling closed off her airway. The state labor board cited the church for the disabled hood and the propped door. The buyer canceled the order. Her daughters finished the remaining orders in a rented kitchen with a working hood and sold the business in April. I think most people would expect a kitchen burn to be one of the biggest cooking hazards. But this next story proves that sometimes the danger is already hiding inside the food itself. It was June 18th, 2019, in Iloilo City. The afternoon rain had stopped by 4 and left the air thick and still. In a rented second-floor apartment unit, an electric fan turned on the lowest setting. The market 2 blocks away was closing its stalls. The man renting it, Dennis Rafael Buencalido, 29, drew floor plans for a small design firm near the provincial capital. He was careful at work, the type who checked dimensions twice. On weekends, he cooked, teaching himself regional dishes from videos and comment threads, and he liked being the one who knew where a recipe came from. He had moved from Manila for the job 3 years earlier, and cooking was how he made friends there. Most Saturdays, his office mates came over for board games, and Dennis made it a point to serve something none of them had tried before. I think a lot of us know someone like that friend who's always looking for something different to put on the table. This time, he wanted to recreate a dish his grandmother used to make in Aklan, one that almost nobody in his office had ever tasted. That morning, he bought several fresh pangy seeds from a specialty produce vendor at the public market. The woman selling them asked whether he planned to ferment them first. Dennis told her he had watched a video claiming that boiling them for several hours was enough. She shook her head and told him the traditional curing process took weeks. Dennis thanked her anyway and bought them. Back at the apartment, he cracked open the hard shells, then boiled the seeds for nearly 3 hours, believing the long cooking time would remove anything dangerous. He wanted dinner ready before his friends arrived and decided there wasn't enough time for the traditional preparation. This was the decision investigators later pointed to. Dennis had replaced generations of food preparation with a shortcut from a video. He cracked open the softened seeds just after 5 o'clock, seasoned them with garlic, vinegar, and chilies, then served them with steamed rice. The flavor was unusually bitter. One friend joked that maybe that was why nobody sold them in restaurants. Dennis laughed and kept eating, convinced the bitterness was simply part of the dish. Most of his friends only sampled a spoonful before returning to the other food on the table. Dennis finished nearly all of the remaining seeds himself. At about 7:15, he suddenly stopped talking and said the room felt like it was spinning. According to witnesses, he got to the sink and vomited twice. His breathing became fast and shallow and never settled. He slid down against the kitchen cabinet, sweating heavily, and soon could not answer simple questions. Within 10 minutes, his arms and legs began jerking. As Dennis's condition rapidly worsened, one friend called for emergency help while another searched the recipe and realized every traditional version began with weeks of fermentation before cooking. By the time paramedics arrived, Dennis was barely responsive. Despite receiving oxygen and emergency treatment, his breathing continued to fail on the way to the hospital. He went into cardiac arrest shortly after arriving and was later pronounced dead. Laboratory testing found cyanide in his blood. Fresh pangy seeds naturally contain cyanide-producing compounds that traditional fermentation is designed to remove. Boiling alone does not reliably make them safe. Police confirmed the leftover seeds matched the same unprocessed batch and ruled the death accidental. Dennis's 4 friends were examined at the same hospital before being released later that night. Dennis's family later donated his handwritten recipe notebook to his younger cousin, who was studying culinary arts. Dennis's friends kept meeting on Saturdays, but they quietly stopped bringing unfamiliar dishes from the internet without first checking them with someone who had actually cooked them before. That case came down to a natural poison. This next one starts with something so small that almost anyone would have ignored it. It was February 2nd, 2015, in Madison, Wisconsin. The kitchen of a second-floor apartment smelled of onion skins and bay leaf. Sleet ticked against the window over the sink. A stock pot had been sitting on low since 7 that morning. The building was quiet. The man at the stove, Martin Gregory Ostlund, 43, had worked as a physical therapist for 17 years, most of them at a rehabilitation clinic on the west side. He handled knee and hip replacements and stroke patients relearning stairs. He was plain spoken, started sessions exactly on the minute, and never let anyone quit a set early. He had grown up on a dairy farm near Cashton where nothing edible was thrown out, and he kept the habit. Every Sunday he made chicken broth from carcasses the butcher sold him cheap, then portioned it out for soups all week. He was paying down a loan on his share of the clinic and tracked grocery spending in a notebook. That Sunday he cooked 3 carcasses instead of 1. He had promised soup to a neighbor recovering from surgery and wanted 2 weeks of it. He simmered the pot close to 12 hours, which is much longer than usual, and by the end the bones had gone soft and were breaking apart in the liquid, including thin wing bones that split lengthwise into slivers. His fine mesh sieve had cracked in December, and he had not replaced it. He strained the broth through a metal colander with wide, round holes, working fast because the pot was heavy and his knee was still bad. His sister had told him twice to line the colander with cheesecloth. He said the holes were small enough and put the containers in the refrigerator without looking at them again. Chilled, the broth was clear and set to a light jelly. On Tuesday, he brought 1 container to work, warmed it in the break room microwave, and stirred in shredded chicken and carrots. He had 8 minutes between appointments and 8 standing at the counter with 2 coworkers. According to the investigation report, on Martin's third or fourth swallow. He stopped eating and set the spoon down. He pressed 2 fingers under his collarbone and coughed a few times. Later on, he casually drank water, then finished the bowl and went back to the floor. A coworker asked him if he was all right, and Martin said he thought the soup had just scratched his throat because it was too hot. By Wednesday morning, Martin called his sister and complained that swallowing hurt enough that he skipped breakfast. Medical records from the urgent care clinic noted a temperature of 101 degrees and pain behind the breastbone that became worse when he leaned forward. At urgent care that afternoon, the doctor diagnosed a throat infection, prescribed antibiotics, and told him to return if his symptoms worsened. He still showed up at work the next day because the clinic was short 2 therapists. However, that night his sister found him on the bathroom floor, sweating, unable to swallow his own saliva, breathing shallow and fast. She called emergency services immediately, and by the time Martin reached the hospital Thursday night, a scan revealed a sharp chicken bone had pierced his food pipe. Surgeons removed it and repaired the tear that evening, but bacteria had already spread into the tissues around his heart and lungs. Despite surgery and powerful antibiotics, the infection continued to worsen. Martin died 6 days later. Investigators later recovered 2 more bone slivers from the remaining broth. The bone itself wasn't what killed Martin. The tiny puncture allowed bacteria to spread into his chest, causing a severe infection his body couldn't overcome. At the rehabilitation clinic, where Martin had worked for nearly 2 decades, staff added a 1-page guide on safely straining homemade stock to the education packets given to post-surgical patients. The container of soup he had prepared for his recovering neighbor was never opened. One thing I've noticed is that not every food accident happens while you're cooking. Sometimes the mistake is made weeks before anyone sits down to eat. It was September 6th, 2021 in Florence, Italy. The back room of a bookshop on Via dei Serragli held the heat of the whole day. The shutters had stayed shut since noon. A row of sealed glass bottles sat on the shelf above the sink. The street was quiet. The man who kept the shop, Emilio Sandro Trabucchi, 38, had taken it over from an uncle in 2009 and had worked nowhere else since. He ordered slowly, priced fairly, and knew which regulars would pay at the end of the month. He had no training as a cook, only his grandmother's notes from a boarding house kitchen kept in a folder behind the register. He had started the monthly reading dinners 8 years earlier. 18 months of closures cut the group from 20 people to 9, and 2 older members had died. His sales were down by 1/3, so he invited 14 for September and planned to send each of them home with a gift. The gifts were bottles of oil. His family said that 3 weeks earlier, Emilio personally had peeled 4 heads of garlic, dropped the cloves into decanters from the flea market, filled them with olive oil, and sealed them with cork and wax. He did not refrigerate them and added no vinegar or lemon. He set them on the shelf above the sink because the light came through them. His sister, a nurse, told him to keep the bottles in the refrigerator, but Emilio believed sealing them tightly was enough. By then, Florence was in the middle of a heat wave, and the back room stayed warm even at night. On the evening of the 6th, he opened the bottle nearest the window. The oil looked normal, and nothing about the garlic seemed unusual to him. He decided everything was fine. He dressed the pasta with it, tasted the sauce several times from the same spoon, and poured an extra spoon of the oil over his own plate. 14 people ate with him. 12 took a bottle home. The guests left before 11. By late the following morning, he texted his sister that his vision had become blurry and he was having trouble reading his phone. When she called, he did not answer. The shop's security camera later showed him arriving just after 1 that afternoon, gripping the handrail with both hands and pausing twice as he climbed the stairs. Around 9, the florist next door stopped by to ask about an order. She noticed Emilio was slurring his words and struggling to answer her. When he tried to move a box of returned books, he quickly set it down and lowered himself to the floor. By the time another employee arrived a short while later, he could barely keep his eyes open. Later, Emilio's sister found him barely able to stay awake and called for emergency help. Doctors gave him antitoxin that evening and placed him on a ventilator when he could no longer breathe on his own. His condition never improved, and he died 10 days later. The cause of death was complications of foodborne botulism. Bacteria growing inside the sealed garlic oil produced a toxin that blocked the nerve signals controlling his muscles, including the muscles needed to breathe. Tests found the same poison in 4 unopened bottles from the batch. All 12 guests who took one home were traced within 2 days, and the 7 with symptoms recovered after early antitoxin. His sister kept the shop open through the winter and set a food preservation guide on the shelf beside the cookbooks. Now, this next case reminds us that sometimes it's the equipment in the kitchen that's far more dangerous. It was January 9th, 2016, in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Freezing rain had glazed the driveway since morning, so the family stayed inside. A radio played in the next room. The stovetop was crowded with jars, a colander, and a stack of clean lids. The man at the stove, Dale Wesley Marchbank, 55, had spent 26 years repairing winches and hydraulic lines at a marina on the Eastern Shore. He worked slowly, kept every receipt, and fixed things twice rather than replacing them. His coworkers trusted him with old equipment because he never rushed it. Every winter he made beef stock in large batches and froze it in yogurt containers for neighbors on his street, mostly older women living alone. He used a stovetop pressure cooker his father had bought in the 1960s, the kind with a twist-lock lid and no second safety latch. He had used it every January for 30 years without a problem. For me, that's what makes this story so uncomfortable. The longer something works, the easier it is to believe it always will. That Saturday, he was making a double batch, enough for 18 containers, because 2 families on the street had someone in the hospital. The cooker was filled past the line, stamped inside, with bones packed to the shoulder of the pot. He had told his son the old cooker held more than the new one. His son had given him a modern cooker for Christmas 2 weeks earlier. It was still in the box in the hall closet. A man at the marina had told him in the fall that the small vent on the lid needed a wire run through it because the water there left scale on everything, and Dale had said he would get to it. He cooked it for 3 hours. The hiss from the vent was thinner than usual and stopped early, which he took as a good sign. It's strange how often warning signs look reassuring when you don't yet know what they actually mean. He turned off the burner at about 3:45 and waited 20 minutes. No steam came out when he tipped the weight, so he assumed all the pressure had already released. He carried the cooker to the sink with 2 oven mitts and started turning the lid counterclockwise. It moved about 1/3 of the way before the lugs let go. The lid blasted upward, dented the cabinet above the sink, and landed in the dish rack. Steam and boiling broth shot straight up, then forward into his face and chest. He was leaning over the pot so it struck his chin, cheeks, throat, and forearms. The near-boiling broth soaked into his flannel shirt, trapping the heat against his chest and stomach. He gasped and inhaled the steam as broth spilled across the counter and floor, leaving splatter marks on the ceiling. His son and daughter-in-law rushed into the kitchen and pulled away his soaked shirt, cooling the burns under running water. Even on the way to the hospital, Dale repeatedly said his throat felt tighter than the burns on his skin. The medical examiner determined that the burns inside Dale's airway were more serious than those on his skin. Steam carries intense heat deep into the throat and can continue causing swelling long after the initial burn, eventually blocking the passage of air. It's one of those injuries that can become far more dangerous after the accident seems to be over. Dale died the following afternoon. Inspectors took the lid apart and found the vent hole nearly filled with hardened scale and dried fat. The pot and lid had no defect. The trapped pressure pushed the lid up as the lugs cleared. A community college added vent inspection to its winter cooking class and displayed the cooker with the family's permission. His son finished the stock and delivered it. Most of us assume that once food reaches the kitchen, the risky part is over. For this next victim, the real danger began out in the water long before the cooking even started. It was April 3rd, 2022, in Siquijor, Philippines. The tide had pulled back past the reef flat by 6 in the morning, leaving wet rock and warm, shallow pools. 6 or 7 women worked the far end with plastic basins. The water near shore looked slightly brown. Filming from the rocks above, Marco Elias Samelo, 32, had worked as a freelance travel writer for 9 years. He wrote hotel copy and airline blog posts to pay the bills in Cebu, while building a food channel with about 1,800 subscribers. Filming and editing everything himself, He preferred ingredients gathered on camera instead of sponsored restaurant features. His mother's dialysis was 3 times a week, and a small streaming platform had asked for a sample episode by month's end. He hoped it could become steady work. The plan that day was a seat-to-table episode. Gather green mussels at low tide, steam them on a portable stove at his rented cottage, and eat them on camera. Although he had filmed cooking videos before, this was the first time he was eating shellfish he had harvested himself. This is one of those cases that completely changes the way you look at the ocean.
We spend so much time worrying about what's alive in the water that we rarely think about what might already be inside the food.
BFAR had issued a red tide advisory at 7 that morning after water samples detected harmful algae off the west coast. The warning was broadcast over local radio to the municipal hall and nearby fishing communities. No sign had been posted yet at the footpath Marco used, which ran behind a row of cottages. A caretaker mentioned the water had looked unusually cloudy for 2 days, but Marco assumed it was just runoff from the rain. He gathered about 4.5 pounds of mussels in a plastic pail between 7 and 8 o'clock. He noted on camera that locals were still collecting, which he took as proof. And that's probably the most dangerous shortcut people make. If enough other people seem comfortable doing something, our brains quietly stop asking whether it's actually safe. He rinsed the mussels, steamed them until the shells opened, and discarded 2 that stayed shut. Nothing smelled unusual. He ate about a dozen while filming. About 30 minutes later, his lips and fingertips went numb. He blamed chili or an allergy, drank some water, and kept filming. Over the next 40 minutes, his speech slowed. He stopped finishing sentences, then set the camera down and left it running. Looking back, those first symptoms sound incredibly obvious. But if they happened to me during lunch, I'm not sure I'd immediately think I needed an ambulance either. By 9:30, the numbness had spread to Marco's arms and legs. He made it as far as the front step before collapsing. A passerby found him unable to stand or even lift his hand. A witness called for emergency help. By the time Marco reached the hospital, his breathing was weakening. Doctors placed him on a ventilator before noon, but he died the following afternoon. The coroner ruled the death accidental due to paralytic shellfish poisoning. The mussels had absorbed a toxin from algae that cooking could not destroy. It gradually shut down the nerves controlling his muscles until he could no longer breathe. Tests found the same toxin in his leftover mussels and shellfish collected from the same shoreline. I think that's the detail that surprised me the most. We're taught that cooking fixes almost everything. In this case, it didn't make any difference at all. Police closed the case as accidental, using the footage, the tourist statements, and the laboratory results. The municipality was found to have received the advisory 2 hours before he began collecting. Signs in 3 languages were installed at 11 shoreline access points before the end of the month. His unfinished footage is now shown during local food safety seminars, and the channel's last upload is a 2-minute notice posted by his brother.
If you've made it this far, you might think every story needs a rare toxin or an unusual mistake. This last case is frightening because it involved a meal that millions of families eat without giving it a second thought.
It was October 27th, 2014, in Birmingham, Alabama. Rain had been falling since noon. 11 people filled a small brick house on the east side. 2 folding tables pushed against the dining table. A football game on mute in the next room. The windows fogged from the stove. 3 generations sat at that table. Harold Dean Kittrell, 64, had spent 40 years as a high school football referee across 4 counties, working Friday nights after his shift at a plumbing supply warehouse. He had retired from both in May, and he still kept his whistle in a kitchen drawer. According to his friends, he was loud, punctual, and hard to interrupt. After his wife died 3 years earlier, the weekly family dinners became his tradition. This one had been moved to Monday because of a funeral, and he had requested collard greens the way his mother used to make them. 9 days earlier, a dentist had fitted him with a lower partial denture and advised him to take smaller bites while adjusting. I guess old habits are hard to break, especially during a meal you've eaten your whole life. He was also taking blood pressure medication that caused a dry mouth, so he drank sweet tea throughout dinner. Investigators later focused on how the collard greens had been prepared. Harold's mother had cooked the leaves whole, simmering them for 4 hours until they became soft and slippery. His daughter later said she had offered to cut them, but he preferred them served that way. They sat down at 7. Harold ate quickly while his retired nurse sister-in-law watched from across the table without noticing anything unusual. As his granddaughter told a story about school, a cousin lifted a phone to record it, capturing Harold in the background during his final ordinary family moment. He loaded his fork, put it in, and swallowed twice while the story was still going. However, the strips did not go down separately. They folded into one soft mass at the back of his throat. As he drew a breath to laugh, it shifted over his windpipe and sealed it. A witness later said he suddenly stopped chewing and sat still for several seconds. Then he pushed back his chair, stood halfway, and grabbed at his throat. He never coughed or called out. His face turned red, then dark, as he struck the table twice with his open hand. It took several seconds for the family to realize Harold was choking because he could not cough or speak. His sister-in-law immediately began abdominal thrusts, while another relative called emergency services, but the blockage did not move. Firefighters arrived and removed the tightly packed greens with specialized tools. Although his heartbeat returned, the prolonged lack of oxygen had already caused irreversible brain injury. He died 2 days later without regaining consciousness. I have to admit, it's unsettling to think that something as ordinary as a serving of vegetables could end a person's life so quickly. The county medical examiner ruled the death accidental. The collard greens had folded into a dense mass that completely blocked Harold's airway. Although the blockage was eventually removed, several minutes without enough oxygen had already caused irreversible brain injury. The school district where Harold had officiated later added choking response and hands-only CPR to its annual training for coaches and volunteers.
From what I've learned, his daughter still cooks collard greens for the family's weekly dinner. The only difference is that she takes extra time to cut them into much smaller pieces.